Good morning, everybody. My name is Zinat Rahman. I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Politics. Welcome. Welcome you to a discussion with Representative Hakeem Jeffries, moderated by IOP Founding Director David Axelrod. Before we begin, I just want to go over some really exciting events that we have this week in the hopes that you will attend. So tomorrow, October 20th at 5:30 p.m. at the Quadrangle Club, we'll have a discussion regarding congressional redistricting with Dave Wasserman of the Cook Political Report and Ali Mutnick of Politico, who will be in conversation with Adam Kincaid of the National Republican Redistricting Trust and Kelly Burton of the National Democratic Redistricting Committee. And then we have a few student-only fellow seminars this week that are really exciting. Today, Russell Moore at 12:30, Evangelical Christianity and Electoral Politics. At 3:30, Catherine Bertini and Earther & Cousin will be talking about no security without food security. Tomorrow, Lutfullah Najafizada, who is here, welcome, and we'll be speaking about how the Taliban took over a country in less than 100 days. And then on 10/21, Tony Fabrizio is going to talk about the issues that drove the GOP yesterday and today. So the fellow seminars are student only, and you could just go to our website to sign up for those. Hope to see you guys there. Audience questions. After the moderated discussion, we'll open up the floor to take questions from you in the audience. Please line up to ask your questions. And everybody's welcome at the microphone. Keep your mask on, and we will give priority to student questions. Please make sure your cell phones are on silent. Food is on the tables on the side. There will be food on those tables on the side to take with you to eat after the event. And it is now my pleasure to introduce Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, Chairman of the House Democratic Caucus and the 5th highest ranking Democrat in House leadership. I turn it over now to David Axelrod, IOP's Founding Director.
Thanks, Zinat. So the idea is you participate in this program and then we feed you when it's over, if you were following along here. Congressman, it's great to see you again. Thank you for being here.
Great to be here.
I know that you'd probably rather be in Washington voting on the reconciliation bill, on the infrastructure bill. When's that going to happen, by the way?
Well, it's going to happen, and I'll be en route back to Washington right after this discussion, and it's great to be here. Last time I was at the Institute of Politics, it was in January of 2019, on the day of the polar vortex. And so I appreciate this unseasonably warm weather here.
No, well, as we were planning this, we knew the day was going to be just like this because we felt so bad about what happened to you last time. So
it worked out. But I think that President Biden promised that he was going to build back better. And that wasn't just a campaign slogan. I think it was a moral imperative because he recognized in the midst of the pandemic, where the American people were dealing with so much pain, suffering, and death, both a public health crisis and an economic crisis, that while certainly we needed to rebuild and emerge from that moment, we couldn't go back to pre-pandemic normal. Because prior to the pandemic, half the American people reported that they couldn't afford a sudden, unexpected $400 expense. Half the American people in the wealthiest country in the history of the world, unacceptable to return to that. So I think this is a transformative agenda that we are going to get over the finish line, but transformational things take time. And it's my hope that we'll be able to land these planes in the next few weeks. That's the objective. But as President Biden said when he came to see us a few weeks ago, he said it may take 6 hours, it may take 6 days, 6 weeks, but we're going to land these planes and we're going to get it done.
Yeah, I guess the question is, can you land them on the same runway at the same time, which is what some people are asking. So before you came to Congress, I was there in the White House when we did the Affordable Care Act, and we had much larger majorities than you had now. So I have a great deal of sympathy for the task, but there are, I think, people who ask, you've got the White House, you've got the House, you've got the Senate, just do it, like this Nike says, right? Just do it. So explain why you can't just do it.
Well, it's a great question, and I think you provided an important reference point. The Affordable Care Act was transformational and really, I think, has altered the course of the public policy landscape in America, where at the time there was a debate about whether health care in America should be a right or is it simply a privilege. And it was an unsettled question. President Obama's decisive leadership settled the question. But it took work to get it over the finish line, a transformational piece of legislation. As you point out, David, more than 250 Democrats in the House, and started with 60, and then when Senator Kennedy passed, 59 Democrats in the Senate. Now, if you juxtapose that to other big moments in American history, transformational things like the New Deal, anchored in Social Security, which I believe FDR passed in 1935. If you can believe this or not, I believe he had 319 Democrats in the House. It was still a contentious debate. And moderate Republicans from the Midwest and the Northeast and the Atlantic states that he could work with, non-existent in the current political landscape. He has 69 Democratic senators. LBJ, who did some important things around civil rights, voting rights, Medicare, Medicaid, I think that was passed in '65. LBJ had about 290 Democrats in the House. He was a little bit more handicapped than FDR. And 68 Democrats in the United States Senate, as well as a whole host of moderate Republicans that he could work with. 2021, we got 220 Democrats in the House. It takes 218 when the House is at full capacity, and we're short 2 seats. And then, of course, a 50-50 margin in the Senate. So the numbers are different, while what we're trying to do is just as transformational, if not more so. It's not an excuse, it's just an explanation for why there'll be some turbulence. If there was turbulence with those incredibly robust majorities, go back and check the historic debates, there's going to be turbulence at this moment.
But let me ask you a question about that, because some would say we're an evenly divided country in our politics. And so, I mean, one of the things we felt was with 59, 60 senators and a large majority in the House, and the president having won a robust victory in the previous presidential election, and he, there was support for what he was trying to do. Is it risky trying to do what you call transformational? And I think there are transformational things in that legislation with the barest of majorities.
Well, I think failure is not an option because of the moment that we're in, where far too many everyday Americans are struggling to make ends meet. And you have a situation where the basic American contract, which has always been work hard, play by the rules, you can provide a comfortable living for yourself and for your family, and retire with grace and dignity for so many Americans, including right here in inner city Chicago, on the south side, on the west side, certainly in many of the neighborhoods that I represent, and in rural America, and in Appalachia, and in small town America. For far too many folks, that basic American contract has been stamped null and void. And we can either let the moment pass or we can act decisively. And I wish we had cooperation from my friends on the other side of the aisle. We don't. Their mantra, and it was the same approach during the Obama years, obstruction today, obstruction tomorrow, obstruction forever. And so I think we have no choice but to act and act decisively. And the things we are trying to do are widely popular with the American people, creating good-paying American jobs through investing in our crumbling infrastructure, investing in home care, investing in child care, continuing the child tax credit, which helps working families, middle-class families, and low-income families, dealing with climate change and the climate crisis with the fierce urgency of now, because there is no planet B. You can go through the entire list. universal pre-K for 3- and 4-year-olds, access to community college. Every single one of these public policy objectives is widely popular with the American people, Democrats, independents, and simple plus majorities of Republicans. So I think we have the high ground in terms of being able to act even with the narrow margins.
So let me ask you, how many of those things do you think the American people, the average person, if you grab someone on the street here, how many of those priorities would they know is in this legislation? And I ask you that because you are a master communicator. People have been listening to you for 10 minutes. They get that sense. Before you had your current position, you were in charge of messaging for the House. Seems to me that not enough has been done. And it's hard when you have these big omnibus bills, but the parts are actually more powerful than the sum. And if you're talking about the sum, how much it's going to cost, you're probably not scoring on a message basis. What do you do about that? And why wasn't more done earlier to make clear what the key elements of this legislation are?
Yeah, it's a good question, and certainly I think, you know, there's so much that we're trying to do. I've said one of our challenges from a messaging standpoint is that we have an abundance of riches that we are necessarily trying to deliver to the American people. And that has, I think, if we're all being honest with ourselves, created some messaging challenges. Now, when we get this done, I think we'll have a real opportunity over a year to be able to communicate what we've done for the American people, why we've done it, and the difference that I think it will make in their lives and their future moving forward, which they should start to also feel. But I think whenever you are working on big pieces of transformative legislation, there's a lot of fine print. And the messaging challenge that we as a party have always confronted, and there's an explanation for it, is that Republicans talk in headlines and Democrats talk in fine print. Now, we talk in fine print for a reason, because we actually care about governing. And if you are trying to get big things done for the American people, you have to master the fine print. And I think we've shown some results as a result of that. Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, Civil Rights Act, Voting Rights Act, Fair Housing Act, Affordable Care Act, American Rescue Plan earlier this year. You don't get those type of decisive things done for the American people unless you master the fine print. So we're kind of in the fine print right now. You govern in fine print, you message, you persuade, you communicate in headlines. Certainly, I think we'll have to increase our intense focus on messaging in headlines as we are landing this plane and as we are talking about the benefits of what we've just done moving forward.
Yeah, you mentioned the American Rescue Act. That included the child tax credit, which people are now receiving and so on. It was one thing you hear is that people don't actually associate it necessarily with the president, with, you know, President Trump, who was less inhibited in many ways.
That's a generous way to describe it.
Yes. Nonpartisan institute, you know. But he, you know, he signed checks. When relief checks went out, they had his big scrawl on it, and everybody knew the checks were coming from him. I think it's, you know, we had this discussion back in the day during the last Great Recession when tax cuts came and so on. And, you know, we showed a little more decorum. But there is this issue that, you know, where's the love for what you're doing?
Yeah. I do think that the Biden child tax credit is incredibly transformative, and it's felt every month. And you're talking about a situation.
Just whether it's felt, whether people said, man, I'm really happy for this Biden tax credit.
So the most important thing, I think, is that it is making a meaningful difference in the lives of low-income families, lifting almost half of children who are in poverty out of poverty, and we have to keep that going. That's an amazing thing. One of the largest changes in dynamics since the Great Society programs. But it's also benefiting working families and middle-class families, the overwhelming majority of whom report using that additional support, $300 for every child under 6, and then, of course, $250 per month for children between the age of 6 and 17. The majority of that is being used for educational expenses, for groceries and food, for diapers, and for child care. And so it really is dramatically improving the quality of life of tens of millions of families. Now, good applause on that one. That's a good thing. Nonpartisan.
No, that's...
But I do think that as we move forward and lock in, making it clear that this is what the president delivered. Democrats in the House supported it, and in the Senate, every single Republican voted against it. And moving forward, right now we're working to extend it. If the majorities change, there's reason to believe it will be taken away. So it's benefiting the American people. One group of folks in Washington supported it and made it happen, and we do have to make that clearer. And the other group, to a person, opposed it and will likely take it away. And that's why elections matter and elections have consequences.
So that is a partisan point. No,
yeah.
But let me just say this.
As the young people say, facts.
Yes, facts. Those are good, facts. I just want to say, I said earlier, you're like a master communicator. I'm a student of communications and politics. I just want to note that you took the question and you repurposed it and made the larger point you wanted to make. Good communications. So,
trying to follow the Axelrod playbook. You know,
yes.
That's what I try to do these days.
Yeah, you're doing well. The question is, now you start with a 3.5 trillion. Sorry, I come from a era when a billion was like a lot of money. 3.5 trillion. You're now, everyone agrees that this bill is going to be smaller, probably in the range of the low 2 trillion. You're having to squeeze a $3.5 trillion worth of toothpaste into a $2.2 trillion tube. We could have a long discussion about how you arrive at 2.2 trillion, and I mean, we went through this on some stuff when I was there, but that's irrelevant. Point is, you have to do it now. And you mentioned the child tax credit. Senator Manchin has said he thinks all these things should be means tested. There are other things that there's a big debate about, maybe cutting some full programs out or just reducing the length of time and essentially daring the Republicans to end what you say, and I think correctly, are broadly supported programs. How do you get the $3.5 trillion worth of toothpaste into the $2.2 trillion tube and get everybody to follow you?
Well, those are discussions that I think are going to increase with intensity over the next few weeks. But President Biden came to see us, as I mentioned, came to the House Democratic Caucus, and he said a couple of important things. One, he said he's not focused on the number. He understands that, and this has been publicly reported, that the $3.5 trillion framework was always a ceiling as it relates to what we thought could be possible to achieve all of these public policy objectives. But that you have to get to 50 votes in the Senate, and the number will land a little bit short of that. Still enormously transformative wherever it lands. And I think the range that he presented was somewhere between 1.9 and 2.2. But the more important point that President Biden made is that let's focus on what we're for, what we are trying to accomplish for the American people, and how we get that done. And, you know, to some degree, you made the point, David, that the budget reconciliation process is a process that's envisioned over a 10-year period of time. That's the window. But you can shorten the window in certain areas and then live to fight another day. And I think one of the things that is being contemplated, to use an example, while I would support a 10-year extension of the Biden child tax credit and think it should be made permanent, there's some debate right now as to whether you shorten that window and live to fight another day, understanding the dynamics, for instance, around the Affordable Care Act. When you deliver good public policy to the American people, it's very difficult to take it away. And that's one of the lessons.
And is that your preference? Would your preference be to look at that rather than throw whole programs out?
Well, I don't want to get out ahead of the...
No, get out ahead of them.
I don't want to get out ahead of the debate, and because it is going to be an active discussion, and I think it's important to hear different perspectives because there's so much passionate interest, correctly, within Democrats in the House in all of these areas, because all of them are so important and so significant that we're going to have to make some difficult choices. But the president also said, and he was correct, this won't be our only opportunity to act decisively on behalf of the American people. You know, one historic example that I often refer to when we're having these debates about what we can achieve and living to fight another day is that the original Civil Rights Act contained the Voting Rights Act provisions that ultimately became the 65 Voting Rights Act. But in 64, it wasn't sustainable for different reasons to be able to get both the crushing blow that the 64 Civil Rights Act dealt to Jim Crow and the Voting Rights Act provisions that Dr. King and others viewed as critical to the civil rights agenda. And President Johnson and Dr. King and civil rights advocates made what I believe was the correct and mature decision to say, we're going to push this as far as we can right now in 64, and we're going to get the 64 Civil Rights Act over the finish line and crush Jim Crow. And they did it. And then we'll live to fight another day on voting rights, which was even more important at the time. And they came back in 65, and Bloody Sunday and Selma and John Lewis's courage helped deliver it. And the moment presented itself, and they acted decisively, and they got it done. And I think that is a potential pathway for us if we're not able to get over our policy priorities in this version of the Build Back Better Act.
The difference, of course, is that there is, and you can't acknowledge this, I'm not going to ask you to acknowledge it, but there's widespread concern that Republicans might take over the House. You only have on paper, a 5-vote margin, and with redistricting, the headwinds that incumbent parties have, there's a better than even chance that Republicans will take over. So doesn't that help inform the desperation that people feel to get their priorities in what many have described as a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to do these transformative things that you're talking about?
I mean, far be it from me to disagree with David Axelrod, but I think, I wouldn't say better than even. I think you're correct that history tells us that I think the average party in power during their first term loses around 27 seats. We've got a 4 or 5 vote margin when we're at full capacity.
Yeah. I'm not a math major, but that doesn't sound good.
Correct. Those are tough numbers. Those are rough numbers. I'm not going to be Pollyannic about that fact. But we also are in the midst of a once-in-a-century public health crisis, and Joe Biden, I think, is leading the way in terms of crushing the virus, a related economic crisis, a racial justice crisis. The other side is on the wrong side of that. Instead of running toward democracy in the aftermath of the insurrection, they're running away from democracy and have doubled and tripled down on voter suppression efforts, which we have to address.
That can't help.
That can't help, but the Senate's going to act tomorrow on the Freedom to Vote Act.
We should get to that, but go ahead.
I anticipated that you would potentially raise
You
that
pitch
question.
and I'll catch.
And I think that, you've got all of these crises that we're confronting. And history also tells us that in crisis moments where there is decisive presidential leadership, and, there are ebbs and flows in presidential popularity, but I think Joe Biden emerges from this moment with a better economy and the virus moving in the right direction, we'll be in a stronger position as we face the midterms.
Okay, but fair to say people feel some sense of urgency
Correct.
about getting their priorities spoken for in this. And by their priorities, these are big priorities. They're not personal priorities.
Right.
They're priorities for the country. But
But we do have 2-year terms, right? So the Affordable Care Act was passed not in 2009, but in 2010, the second year of President Obama's presidency at that point in time. So what I'm suggesting, and I'm not trying to make any news here, is that, there's still a lot of opportunity to legislate even beyond this particular moment, within this term.
you mentioned the Senate's going to vote tomorrow on the Voting Rights Act. You've spoken on the filibuster as an obstacle here. That obstacle still looms. I haven't seen anything in the last 24 hours that suggests to me that they're going to be successful unless there's a carve-out on the filibuster. Do you think there will be?
I certainly hope that there will be.
But do you think there will be?
I think increasingly it's more likely than not. I think Senator Manchin, understandably, is going through a process where he's trying to find common ground with Senate Republicans. And my view is he should be allowed to go through that process. He has relationships with the other side of the aisle. These are very reasonable provisions in terms of protecting the sanctity of the right to vote, applicable to Democrats and independents and Republicans. It's not a partisan thing. We just want every voice to be heard legitimately in our democracy. And by the way, this was a settled question for a long period of time, for over 40 years in American history. Every time the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized, after it was first passed in '65, it was signed back into law by a Republican president after passing the Congress with bipartisan majorities. 1970, Richard Nixon; 1975, Gerald Ford; 82, Reagan; 2006, George W. Bush. So what happened? I don't know. Maybe the intervening election of 2008. And some folks deciding that went too far. And so we got to do something about America changing in this fashion. I say all that to say that Senator Manchin correctly should be given the runway to see if he could reach back into the pre-2006 or pre-2008 Republican Party to find allies on voting rights and to work that process. My suspicion is he won't find any allies sufficient to break the filibuster. And then he's got to answer the penultimate question. Isn't democracy worth getting this over the finish line? Or are you going to allow the obstructionists to prevail? When there are already, last point on this, 2 exceptions to the filibuster that exist. We're just saying you should create a third. Budget reconciliation is an exception to the filibuster that the Republicans used to pass the GOP tax scam in 2017. 83% of the benefits going to the wealthiest 1% to subsidize the lifestyles of the rich and shameless unnecessarily. Saddling all of you with $2 trillion worth of debt. That's the GOP tax scam. That's an exception to the filibuster that allowed that to pass. And then Mitch McConnell used the judiciary exception to the filibuster to steal not 1, but 2 Supreme Court justices. 1 from President Obama and 1 from President Biden. 2 Supreme Court justices stolen, using an exception to the filibuster. And we can't have a democracy exception to protect your right to vote? I think at the end of the day, to me, that seems like an argument that Joe Manchin would be prepared to embrace once he goes through his process.
And everybody else, cinema and the other.
And everyone else. I think Manchin's the key, but everyone else.
You know, a lot has been made, I think, justifiably about restrictions that make it harder for people to vote. I find even more alarming the voter nullification provisions that, for example, were passed in Georgia that would essentially arrogate to the legislature the right to kind of to overrule the count, as it were. And had that been in place in several states in 2020, we know the outcome might have been different. Do you think more emphasis should be placed on that? That seems like a heat-seeking missile right at the heart of democracy.
You're absolutely correct. Jim Clyburn, the great Jim Clyburn, has talked a lot about this. A lot of it is anchored in his experience in the South, dealing with nullification issues, often as a result of Supreme Court decisions like Brown v. Board of Education, followed by nullification at the state level, and then necessary federal intervention. He's lived through this experience, talks a lot to us about it. This strikes exactly and directly at the heart of our democracy. And it is one of the conversations that we're having with the Senate about how to deal with this issue as part of our democracy reform efforts. Because, you know, I think the ultimate question that all of you should grapple with, and something that we may be seeing, and there's still good people in the House and in the Senate, good Republicans. But there's a question that has to be asked, which is if some right-wing conservatives conclude, as they may have, that they can no longer win elections democratically, are they going to abandon right-wing conservatism, or are they going to abandon democracy? And some of them, I believe, have answered with the latter. We're not giving up our philosophy, even if it's unpopular in so many parts of the country. We're going to abandon democracy. I mean, you go all the way back to Clinton won the popular vote twice. And then Al Gore won the popular vote. Bush won it the second time. And then Obama won the popular vote twice. And then Trump lost the popular vote twice. I'm no mathematician, but I think that's 7 out of the last 8 elections. So I think some have concluded we're going to do whatever we have to do to maintain power without adjusting how we articulate public policy to the American people. And that's what nullification, I believe, is all about, and that's a frightening thing.
A couple more questions. You're also a member of the Judiciary Committee, and you've been a leader on criminal justice reform issues and policing issues. Another impasse that was reached was on the policing issue. I know you have 2 sons. You probably have a very personal perspective on these issues. Where does that stand? And what, you know, you have a new mayor in New York, who you know well, former borough president from the borough you represent, who is a former police officer, and he ran a campaign that basically said we have to find the balance between rights, which are undebatable, and safety, which is unsacrificable.
Yeah.
Where are we right now on all these issues?
Well, you know, we passed the George Floyd Justice and Policing Act, which would have been, you know, a transformative bill had we gotten it to President Biden's desk. We passed it in the House not once but twice, and then we got involved in the Senate discussion, being led by Tim Scott, who seemed at first to be serious.
Senator from South Carolina.
Senator from South Carolina. African-American conservative senator from South Carolina. And seemed to be serious about it, has had his own personal experiences with, you know, police interactions that have gone awry. Now, that's not to say that we want to paint a broad brush in terms of law enforcement. We embrace law enforcement. The overwhelming majority of police officers who I interact with at home in Brooklyn are hardworking public servants in the community to protect and serve. But we cannot deny that we have a police violence problem in America, a police brutality problem in America, a police use of excessive force problem in America, often a lack of accountability, and it disproportionately impacts low-income communities of color, particularly African-American men. We've all seen it. And if the political realities of the moment don't allow for us to get this legislation over the finish line because Senator Scott has, at the moment, walked away from it, we can't give up. Just like those civil rights activists and foot soldiers didn't give up, you know, after trying in the 50s into the early 60s, and they couldn't get civil rights legislation over the finish line. They didn't give up. Because the arc of the moral universe, as Dr. King said, bends toward justice. So we have to keep it going. And it is personal. Like the George Floyd killing, that wasn't brought to me by my chief of staff, a fellow member of Congress, my legislative director. It was brought to me by my then 15-year-old son, who said, "Dad, it's happened again. What are you going to do about it?" And we just have to do something about it. Can't have an America where I have to have the same conversation with my son, my two African-American sons, about what to do when stopped by the police. So when one of them comes to me and says, "I'm going to go participate in these protests," I said, "As long as you ain't protested me." I'm going to go, I'm out on the streets. I said, "Well, okay, it's hot out there, right? Streets are hot. And if you make sure you carry your identification, your school ID, you may have been 16 at the time, make sure you carry your school ID, 1. 2, because if you don't have an ID, you're going to be jammed, and that's a reason that they may use to just take you in. Then if they take you in, and they're being aggressive about it, just don't react. Be calm, cool, and collected. Even if they are being unnecessarily and illegitimately aggressive, because if you react, it could go wrong, and you might not make it back home." I have to say this to my 16-year-old son. And then I said, if they accuse you of doing something that you know you didn't do, and then lie to you and say, "Well, if you sign this paper, it'll all go away," do not believe them, because it will not. But the law permits them to lie to you. So just ask for your parents. Now, I've got to have this conversation. It's been colloquially referred to as the talk with my two sons. 30 years after my father had the same conversation with my brother and I. That's how I know how to say exactly what I need to say. This is America. We have to solve that problem. I don't want my grandkids to have the same conversation that my father had with me and I had with my two sons with their children. So we will get it done. We will not give up. Right now the pathway is through administrative action, and the Justice Department and the Attorney General will be before us on Thursday, and I'll probably ask them a few questions about this.
We're going to be taking questions in just a couple of minutes, so you can queue up here in the center aisle, and we'll prioritize students first. I'd like to alternate men and women here to the extent possible. There's a mic back there. Let me ask you two more quick questions. One is very complex, and so it's unfair to ask you this late, but just a general kind of sense. You're also on the subcommittee that deals with internet issues. Yeah. Do you expect significant action from Congress to deal with the abuse of social media? We talked about issues affecting our democracy. This is one of them, the spread of disinformation, the pernicious role of algorithms driving people toward conspiracy theories and disinformation and inflaming people. Do you expect that there'll be significant action on the part of Congress?
I do, and there should be, because, and I think you sort of locked in on the exact problem that we have, which is intentional decisions are being made using algorithmic bias to facilitate the spread like wildfire of hatred, misinformation, and conspiracy theories. That's not a tolerable business practice, and it has real consequences. We've seen at least 3 major ones in the last few years. What happened in 2016, connected to Russian interference in the election and their ability to manipulate parts of the electorate with disinformation. What's happening with COVID right now, and what happened in facilitating the January 6th insurrection. I mean, we've got 3 real-world examples of the problem right in front of us. I think we have to act, and I believe we will.
And then the last thing is, you know, got a lot of young people here. They look at Congress, and they look at the leadership of Congress, and I am a great fan of Speaker Pelosi. I worked with her. I think she'll go down in history as a historically important figure, not just because she was the first woman. That said, you look at the seniority system in the House, committee chairs and so on. There is kind of a Jurassic Park feel to the whole thing. And there are a lot of talented people who are sitting there waiting their turn and get old waiting for their turn. Shouldn't there be a reform of that system? Shouldn't there be some merit-based kind of approach to this so that you have your best players on the field in these key positions?
Well, you know, the seniority system is, and I agree with exactly what you said about Speaker Pelosi. She's been an amazing transformational figure.
I figured it wasn't about the Jurassic Park part.
And so so has the entirety of the leadership team that sits above Catherine Clark, myself, and Pete Aguilar, who are newer members of the leadership team.
They're 30 years older than you are.
That's correct. But you know, they bring a wealth of experience and accomplishment that I think has been required at this moment. But on the leadership side of the question, there is no seniority dynamics. It's, you know, you run, there are elections, and the caucus decides. And that's always been the case on the leadership side. Seniority comes into play connected to the committee process. Now, it's not lockstep seniority, although it generally works out that the person who has the most experience winds up becoming the committee chair or the ranking member. Seniority in the rules of the House Democratic Caucus is a factor, not the only factor. Now, I do think that you've seen over the last 10 years a new generation come in to Congress, largely anchored around the class of 2012, which I was a part of, Sherry Bustos, so many others, Catherine Clark. And the class of 2018, which gave us the majority, which was an amazing group of Americans who saw the house on fire, and instead of running in the other direction or standing in place, they ran toward the fire to try to put it out. Most of whom are still in Congress, and most of whom have subcommittee gavels right now. And many of them will emerge, I think, in the next few years to have full committee gavels. So I feel good about where we are. We do want to make sure that all of our best players are on the field and playing the right position. That's constantly a work in progress, but it's something that we're committed to doing.
I am too smart to ask you about your own future. Let's just stipulate that your name is widely circulated as someone who might replace the Speaker. And as you point out, that is an election of the caucus. I will spare you the gymnastics of avoiding answering that question, and we'll go to questions from the audience.
Hi, so I'm Jacob. I'm a first year at the college, and I was just wanting to ask you about the Equality Act, because I know the House passed it earlier, but it seems pretty dead on arrival in the Senate, as it doesn't even have 50 co-sponsors. And I was just wondering, like, what you think the lay of the land is on, like, getting LGBTQ rights passed, especially with the Republican assault on them.
Yeah, no, thank you for that very important question. And as you pointed out, we've passed the Equality Act in the House. I think we had a handful of Republican members of the House who have supported it in both the previous term and in our current term. That's some progress. I've reason to believe that if it made it to the floor of the Senate, there would be bipartisan support for it. Again, you know, we're dealing with the filibuster dynamics where it's tough to get to 60, and it does halt progress. But we have the high ground here, and we have to make sure that there's full equality of opportunity and participation for every single American on race and on gender and on religion, certainly on sexual orientation and identification. And that is something that I believe we ultimately will achieve. I'm hopeful in this area. The first meaningful vote that I ever cast as a public servant was on marriage equality in 2007, when there were Democrats in the state assembly who voted against it. And ultimately, just a few years after that, after voting on marriage equality 4 different times, but it was dead on arrival in the New York State Senate, we ultimately got it over the finish line. And it was supported by Democrats and a handful of Republicans. So I think over time, on this issue, the Equality Act will become law.
All right, thank you.
Wait, before you come forward, speaking of equality of a different sort, I had asked that we alternate male, female, kind of, so.
Hello, hi, my name is Camelia. I'm a first-year MPP student at Harris. I'm originally from New York, Brooklyn, so really excited to hear from you.
Brooklyn is always in the house.
Yeah,
we appreciate that.
So my question was, do you still think the Electoral College has purpose in terms of the fact that, like, obviously popular vote seems to be a little bit more significant, yet in the end, the electoral vote wins? Like, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's a tough issue. It's part of, you know, the compromises that were undertaken in Philadelphia in connection with the founding of the Republic. It is perverse to some degree that we've now seen 2 examples in this century, in both 2000 and then in 2016, where the person who lost the popular vote, in the most recent case by millions, went on to become president because of the quirks of the Electoral College. However, because it's in the Constitution, the route to change it is very complicated, because it either means that you've got to pass a constitutional change in the House and in the Senate at a 2/3 threshold. It's signed into law, and then 75% of the states have to ratify the change, which some of the small states are just not going to do it because it gives them outsized, disproportionate power. And there may be some workarounds around the national popular vote, and I'd urge you to kind of look into that movement. You may have already done so, where states could possibly enter into a compact to agree that their electoral college votes will go to the person who wins the national popular vote. And if enough states agree to the compact, then it kicks in, and the popular vote winner will always be the president. And I think that is probably the more likely route. We're still short of the number of states to do it, but it's a more efficient route to achieve the result than a constitutional change.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Rohil. I'm a first-year undergraduate in the college. So I was just wondering, like, do you think the unwillingness of the GOP to work across the aisle is more of like a kind of Mitch McConnell issue and will stay like as he is like in Congress, or do you think it's kind of like something that's here now but will probably or hopefully go away later?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, first of all, on Mitch McConnell, he described himself as the Grim Reaper. Right? Who does that? This is his description of his role.
It is almost Halloween.
That's right. And so he's very clear that he's chief obstructionist, Dr. Doom, Grim Reaper. That's who he is. Now, I will say that although on a lot of issues there's a lot of obstruction, I think the narratives that come out of Washington, and I know, David, you've spoken a lot about this, aren't always accurately reflective of some of the cooperation that actually does take place, even amongst people who fiercely disagree on other issues. You know, we worked with the Trump administration, Democrats and Republicans, progressives and conservatives, to get meaningful criminal justice reform over the finish line in the First Step Act, which built upon the Fair Sentencing Act that acts in the Obama administration, President Obama led on in 2010. And that work continues. And it continues in a bipartisan way. The most recent example is, some of you may be familiar with, one of the biggest stains of the war on drugs was that there was 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between how crack cocaine users were treated and powder cocaine. Even though there is no pharmacological difference between how crack cocaine and powder cocaine affect the body. They're both equally addictive. No pharmacological difference. I've always wanted to use that word, pharmacological. I don't know if I can spell it, but I know what it means. No difference in chemical reaction. So why was there 100-to-1 sentencing disparity? Because crack cocaine was the drug of choice in the inner city and in low-income communities of every race, and powder cocaine used in more affluent neighborhoods and in the suburbs. President Obama's leadership dropped that disparity from 100-to-1 to 18-to-1 in the Fair Sentencing Act in 2010. Didn't get a lot of attention. It was significant. Sessions blocked that change from being retroactive as part of when he was in the Senate, as part of the First Step Act, which did a whole lot of other things and has resulted in the release of more than 10,000 people at the federal level, overwhelming majority black men who were there on unjust sentences. We made that 18-to-1 change retroactive. We just passed the Equal Act a few weeks ago that eliminates the crack cocaine, powder cocaine disparity in its entirety. That's why it's called the Equal Act. And makes that change retroactive to reach back in to people who are currently in on unjust sentences. It passed the House 361 to 66. Jim Jordan voted for it. Matt Gaetz voted for it. Louis Gohmert voted for it. I think Marjorie Taylor Greene may have even voted for it. Like, I'm serious. Has anyone reported that? Such a significant change done in a bipartisan way? So, yes, we have some obstructionists in the Congress on some critical issues. And I will always fiercely call that out. But I also think there's reason to be hopeful that at the same time, there are other areas where we're working on significant issues to the American people, in this case, criminal justice reform, that are underreported and underappreciated. And we all probably have to do a better job of projecting out that cooperation that is still taking place with fierce rivals, because certainly there's some inside the Beltway interests who have no commitment to reporting anything other than conflict and controversy, and that presents you all, I think, with a distorted picture, even in a very divided America.
Well, beating up on the media probably will get you bipartisan consensus in Washington.
I'll try not to use the word media.
Yes.
Hello, my name is Lainey. I'm a fourth year in the college. And I heard you mention early on in this discussion that you think the Republican Party is broadly on the wrong side of racial injustice issues. I'm writing my BA thesis on broadly the issue of social media, like worsening political polarization, and specifically on issues like police brutality and racial injustice. And so I wanted to ask you, to what extent do you think that social media worsens or perpetuates the issues of like racial injustice, police brutality, et cetera, specifically with the lens of like viewing these issues as partisan rather than public issues?
It's a very important point, very important exploration that you're undertaking. And I think that as Axelrod and I talked about earlier, you know, the algorithmic issues which intentionally facilitate polarizing content. This is a business strategy that has been adopted by some of these social media companies that I don't think serve the best interest of the American people, whether you're a progressive or a conservative. It doesn't serve either side, this polarization. And I think we have to explore it. And I think it's important for us to explore it, particularly on these very sensitive issues around race, which has always been very complicated in America. We've come a long way. We still have a long way to go. And when we have fuel being added to the fire through the vehicle of social media, that is a very unhelpful thing.
Before we take the next question, I just want to reach back. Thank you for yours.
Thank you.
I want to reach back to the last question. You talk about these areas of cooperation, but the incentive structure is a little perverse in our politics right now because cooperation is costly if it is too visible. Yeah. How do you overcome that? Because ultimately, people prize their seats. They want to get reelected. If cooperation means they might sacrifice their seats, you know, I always say Profiles in Courage was a thin volume for a reason. It's not the natural act of a politician. What do you do about that?
Yeah, I do think that leaning into cooperation, and there were, when we were first approached about working on criminal justice reform with the Trump administration, there was some skepticism, and I refused to go to the White House. Now, I refused to go to the White House because I didn't want to be caught up in some situation that I had seen around Dreamers and seen around guns, that there's some issue that's in the public domain. The former president invites Democrats and Republicans into some conference room in the West Wing. He makes a big show, and then nothing happens. So I said, nope, I'm not going to the White House. But if Jared Kushner wants to come see Cedric Richmond, who was the chair of the CBC at the time, Congressional Black Caucus, and myself, in the member dining room on the Hill, I'm happy to have this conversation. And he came, to his credit. We had the conversation. I looked him in his eyes, talked about his father's incarceration. I knew that there was a real climate for cooperation in criminal justice because of fiscal conservatives, Christian conservatives, and libertarians coming our way. And I said, this is something worth trying to do. And there were some bumps in the road, and some of my friends, you know, on the left were like, you can't trust the Trump administration. You'll never get this done. He's playing you for a fool. But we decided that the urgency of the issue required trying, and we were able to get it done. So I do think that if you can make a substantive difference in the lives of the American people in an area, that they'll embrace cooperation. But you do make a good point. Last observation on this. The incentive structure has changed. Someone presented to me something interesting about the Watergate midterm elections in '74. And maybe the students connected to the Institute can confirm this, but I think it was largely accurate. That in that swing election, there were north of 200 seats that could have been won theoretically by either a Democrat or a Republican. Almost half the Congress in a midterm election could lose in a general election. You know what that number is right now? 35 to 40 is the playing field that we operate under, for the most part. Sometimes they go a little bit higher in a swing election, but it's usually 35 to 40. Democrats were at the high end of that in 2018 when we took back the House, 40. So if we were at a place where half the House could lose a general election, that's a different incentive structure than when only a tenth of the House can lose a general election. Because that means that 90% of the House is more concerned about a primary when you're thinking about political survival, where you are worried about someone not getting to your left or not getting to your right. And that's bad for America, that's bad for cooperation, that's bad for finding common ground. So there, I think gerrymandering reform and creating more balanced districts would actually improve the incentive to cooperate within the House, which is the tip of the spear in terms of our democracy.
A whole another discussion we should have here sometime. I've got to get you out so that you can solve this problem about these two bills. But so let me take one more question very quickly. Go ahead.
And then, if you don't mind, I think we can, just so that there's balance, and we sometimes do this in the House, we'll take two questions together and I'll answer them both at the same time.
All right, go ahead. Yeah. So you ask yours and then next question.
Hi, Congressman. Thank you so much for being here. My name is Chris. I'm here at the college. In the beginning of the talk, we spoke a lot about the Build Back Better plan and how it's important to improve the financial health of people, particularly lower income people in this country. Right now, we're seeing a lot of inflation, a lot of price increases. People are becoming poor. Their money is not as valuable anymore. Price of gas, I believe, is up almost 50% in some places. Is that a problem for you? Does anyone in Washington care about that? And what are we going to do to solve that?
Yeah.
Great. And then
Hi, I'm Manisha. I'm a dual degree student with the MBA and MPP programs, and I have a ton of student debt. And I know there's been talk about forgiving student loans, and there's been pushback from Biden. So I wanted to know if there is any hope of making that happen or just making education cheaper in general for people.
Yeah, no, thank you. Two great questions. I'll take the first one quickly. In terms of, gas prices are up. That's not a good thing. There are obviously global issues connected to that. Gas prices ebb and flow throughout different presidencies. And, I think the administration should look at all available options, but they're limited in terms of the tools that they have. From the broader perspective in terms of other consumer goods, I do think that creates a challenge. It creates a challenge in a couple of different ways. One, there are supply chain issues that I think we have to try to decisively address in partnership with industry. Some of that is connected to the pandemic. Some of that is connected to workforce issues. Some of that is connected to geopolitical dynamics beyond our borders. But that the administration has to look at all three of those factors and more to try to decisively deal with it. The other problem that we have in America is that while the productivity of the American worker since the early 80s has increased, I believe, by north of 275%, wages during that same period of time have increased by less than 10%. And executive compensation has increased by orders of magnitude beyond productivity. That's an unacceptable situation. And so we have to work collectively to lift up the wages of everyday Americans. And I'm not just talking about a minimum wage, I'm talking about a living wage, so that when people work hard and play by the rules, they can provide for themselves and for their families. So it certainly is a critical issue that I believe the Biden administration is going to address decisively. And on student loans, certainly it's a challenge that I think we have right now north of $1.5 trillion in collective student loan debt in America. That's a very different kind of debt than the only other form of debt which is higher, which is mortgage debt. And because of it, because of how higher education is now structured, you have young people who may not be able to start a family or purchase a home or even take entrepreneurial risks, right, which may require not having a traditional 9-to-5 job, but are afraid of abandoning a 9-to-5 job because of those student loan payments. That's all bad for the economy. So there's real impact. And I think the president has committed to wiping out at least $10,000 worth of student loan debt for everyone, and I believe the administration thinks they have the power to do that via executive order. The debate right now within Congress is that the administration doesn't believe they can go further without legislation. There is legislation to address up to $50,000 of student loan debt, which I support and has a lot of support. And I'm not just saying that because I'm in front of a bunch of students. It's the right thing to do for the reasons that I articulated earlier. But that requires a legislative path. I certainly think the votes exist in the House to do it. As with everything else, struggle in the Senate, but it's something that we're committed to accomplishing.
Thank you so much. Thanks for your questions. I do have to, one correction of myself, because we talk about democracy. The people of New York have actually not yet elected a mayor. That will happen in November. Highly likely that Eric Adams will be the next mayor of New York, but he's not mayor yet. So I've thought about that.
He's on his way, though.
Okay, there you go. Anyway, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, David.
I hope that you will, whenever you're in town, you'll come back and see us, and we will watch your progress with interest.
Look forward to it. Thank you, David.
Thank
you, everyone.
Thank you all.
All right.